Hey, what's up? It's Jim, and today I'm going to talk about Clerks from 1994. The appeal of this movie is very much the story behind it. This was a small film made for apparently, $27,575, and then was sold to Miramax, started Kevin Smith's directorial career, and gave a kid out of nowhere a shot at Hollywood by making a film just about his life working at a convenience store and him and his friends talking shit. It inspired so many people to feel like that they could pick up a camera, much like Kevin Smith had felt inspired to do this himself. Now, I think a lot of people look at this film, especially now because filmmaking is cheaper than it was in 1994 with technology and everything, that anyone could frankly do this. And since no one has actually literally done what he's done, I would say that's probably not true. But the appeal of this movie is interesting because I definitely have heard people like slack it off, just be like, he was lucky. Certainly that is part of it. And a lot of the filmmaking choices in this are very kind of simple kind of things. You know, why are the shutters shut during this film? It's because someone stuffed gum in the locks and they couldn't open it is the reason for in the movie. But in actuality, like, he couldn't shoot during the daytime, and they didn't want people thinking the store was open, so they had to come up with a reason for that. They had to come up with a reason to shoot at other locations between the wake and, you know, playing hockey on the roof. So many different reasons to get this film to work, and you don't really question it as like film students just like having to make concessions to make their movie work. There's a lot of that in this movie. It's a very rough, kind of raw film schooly film, but I think the difference between that and as someone who has seen a lot of film student films is that this film very much flows and feels like an actual movie. Like it really does. I'm not questioning it and feeling the rawness, unpolishedness that you usually see with this, the amateurness. It's there. You can't take that away from it. It is a rough movie. It's shot in black and white. It looks grummy and cruddy and all those things. But it works within that so well, and I think that's one of the appeals of Clerks. It might be aesthetically the only film Kevin Smith ever made that worked really that well. That's the one thing about this film that made it live on and gave Kevin Smith such a career, is because certainly he was inspired by Richard Linklater. He thanks Spike Lee at the end of this film. He's talked about other independent filmmakers, and this is an independent film. It's one of the bigger independent films of all time. Financially, it obviously is an independent film, but Kevin Smith, this was probably the most indie film he ever made. I know Chasing Amy was, you know, financed independently as well, but he made, you know, other kind of indie-ish movies, but I'd say because this has more influence of what you'd consider an indie filmmaker, an art house filmmaker. Indie really is just a financial term, but we decided it means more. And under that guise, I think of the 90s, this felt more a part of that than any of his other movies, really. As well as Kevin Smith, he's not a guy who buys every entry in the Criterion Collection, and I don't think he's going to say he does. He has more of a mainstream kind of taste. I mean, hell, they had a debate about Return of the Jedi in this movie. And I think that works for this film's advantage because for a lot of people, this is their first independent film. This is their first indie art housey film, and this is a very easy entry into that. You know, for a cruddy black and white film that was made in the mid-90s, this would get played on various different cable channels. It's been very accessible to people despite the language and everything like that. And I think that's because Kevin Smith, you know, why he could work with movie stars and do what he did later is in this movie. It feels like, you know, more mainstream kind of thing, more so than I think Richard Linklater's Slacker, which he felt gave him the permission to sort of make a film, or Spike Lee or something. Both of them feel more arty and weirder and stuff. I don't think Clerks is like weird at all. I think it's very pretty straightforward and straight ahead, and like it feels like it could be a film that a normal kind of consumer would actually watch. I don't think that's like a bad thing about it. I actually think that works really well in this, maybe more so than any of his other films. I grew up, you know, as a teenager really liking Kevin Smith films, and Jay and Silent Bob Strike Back came out my senior year of high school, so I sort of kind of lived through the View Askew-universe in its prime, and this is a movie that always felt cooler because certain kids saw it once or whatever. I obviously got more obsessed. You had guys talking about Star Wars in ways that I had never really seen before at that time. Now it's, by the way, a lot of his nerdy dialogue does not feel special now, but at the time it really was. And it's also that he's not talking about the minutia of, you know, very lame kind of funky things that you wouldn't necessarily understand, which I think is what nerd culture sort of becomes. He talks about like Return of the Jedi, which is a hugely successful film, and goes into, this independent contractor thing, and suddenly you're like, you can totally understand that and get into nerd culture. And I think this makes it accessible and interesting and funny kind of conversation you would have at a comic book store. And I literally have heard people directly quote all this crap, all of his dialogue about comic books and pop culture in actual comic book stores in the actual 90s, like flat out, and people would laugh and think it's hilarious. It was the Family Guy quotes of its day or something. In the 90s, comic books and nerd culture was sort of becoming a bigger and bigger thing. And Kevin Smith, I think, especially with this film and with his later films as well, was able to sort of tap into something, but also sort of be his own thing. If you look at a lot of his dialogue, the sexual content and the pop culture references, it's all filtered through him. And I think that's what really works about it. You feel like it's curated, whether it's curated by someone who, is the highest of high art or something. It's not. It's by Kevin Smith, who's sort of an average, normal kind of guy who's got slightly weirder taste. But I think that's sort of like what made this so accessible. It's also, about a guy who wasn't supposed to be here today. It's about a guy who is stuck going to work on a day he's supposed to have off and being stuck there the whole day. That's something more people can relate to than you really think about. And certainly, like, it is very freeform. Even he's admitted that, like, the original ending where Dante gets killed was really just there because he didn't have an ending. And even the ending is just like Randall throwing his jacket at him and saying, like, you're closed. That's it. But it's a slice of life thing. The funny thing that about it is all the roughness of it. When I was thinking about, like, what I was reading later after watching the film about, how he didn't really have an ending and he wasn't sure what to do with it and the flow of it and everything like that, I was like, that didn't bother me, because that's this movie. It's just a day. Random shit happens in a day, between like the Chuli's gum thing, which that like definitely doesn't work. It's any weak part of this movie, the Chuli's gum thing. Whoa, I do not like that. It's kind of funny. It also has a good punchline to it. It shows Kevin Smith, regardless of you think any of these scenes are funny or not, understands at least how to structure a joke. I found that to be almost annoying after a certain point, but I was like, oh, I totally get, like, you structured it correctly, where it's like you get like your punchline, your little story and everything like that. Same with, like, with his thing with his girlfriend and he's sucked 37 dicks and everything like that. And which I also find interesting, he has a whole thing, which I guess I'll get into more if I ever review Chasing Amy, about like his girlfriend having more sexual experience than him seems to be a huge threat with him, which I totally don't really completely empathize with at all. It's definitely a running theme, especially in these earlier films. It definitely like really messes with him, his male ego. Seeing that here, I was like, that is like a total theme going on. The kind of small townness of being in a store like that, or being in a community, talking about like the girl who dies in the swimming pool, talking about people who had sex with whom in high school who remember this party, things like that are very relatable. And I think, it's kind of random things going on felt to me like, when I still was kind of young, I think it was in middle school, but when I was like older, I'd watch this movie and go, yeah, that's like a night out, you like dance with friends at a boombox at this one thing, you like talk to this person for a little bit, then you go to a show, then you do, they don't go to a show in this, but you do, some nights you go and do 28 different things, and then, the night's over. And his messiness works in that. That's how life is, And I just think, like, people always say he got lucky because this got bought, and certainly, like, yeah, sure, definitely, I'm not going to deny that. But I think he also got lucky in terms of, like, the story he was making and the kind of simple film totally worked with this. If he had made, like, a Tarantino ripoff, we would not be talking about Kevin Smith right now. He made a film that worked under his own limitations, and that's how real filmmakers work. That's why this film has lived on and stuff. Remember in Jaws, we always talk about Jaws, how the shark wouldn't work, so they had to find ways around it. That's what filmmaking is. Filmmaking is problem solving. And his problem solving was so smart that he realized what he was really problem solving was finding a way to get his limited abilities to work within a film. And that's what works so well about Clerks. I don't know if it's really a great movie, to be honest with you. I am so sort of personally attached to it because I watched it so much. It felt like this dirtier, less accessible movie. These guys are just gonna talk, when anybody else was into like dumber, what I thought were dumber. This film is not that much smarter. Mainstream movies or whatever. I was like, I'm watching Clerks because I know what indie film is or something. It did feel cooler at the time. It did feel like a cooler comedy, but it is not very different. It's like baby's first indie movie or whatever, but somebody has to be that. You know, we can rag on it and say like, oh, I'm too hoity-toity or whatever. This film got into the National Film Registry. Like, it's an actual, considered a very important film. I don't think it actually influenced that much in terms of like actual copycats of Kevin Smith. I think it influenced people up until like maybe recently in the YouTube area. Everyone from like Red Letter Media to Doug Walker to so many like clones I've seen of this over the years, because it inspired you, you know, much like when he looked at Richard Linklater's Slacker and felt like he had this invitation to make a movie. This feels like you do. It feels like, oh, hey, my friends and I say funny things, I think, and we can make something out of that, maybe. And if you're like me, you did. And years later, people are still talking about it and stuff. And you get lucky. But I think a lot of people don't get that chance. But I think what this film really shows you is it is a good film for first-time filmmakers, because it shows you effective problem solving under a limited budget. And that's what really indie filmmaking is. As well as I think Dante and Randall, you know, Dante being the straight man, very like center, like he's being like persecuted. I've heard it's sort of influenced by Dante's Inferno. I'm not really sure. I know there's like those title cards. I still don't understand if those things I've seen this film. It's been a while since I've seen it, but I used to watch this film a lot, and I have no clue if those title cards make any sense. I'm sure I read on some Tripod or GeoCities website how they did. I don't get it. Whatever. They're fine. I like Brian O'Halloran's performance. I think, you know, it does feel very like novice, like a lot of the actors, but I think, you know, there's also good talent in any community who can do stuff. You know, I actually like a lot of the acting in this for what it is. You know, I sort of actually really dislike when people shit on an indie film and they're like, well, the acting is not as good as, you know, when I saw, you know, this huge $100 million blockbuster movie or something with like professional movie stars who've had years of training. I'm like, yeah, what were you expecting here? I've always actually sort of liked the acting for what it is. And I think Brian O'Halloran, and especially Jeff Anderson, I thought was like the coolest as Randall, the coolest person in the whole world when I was a kid. It was because, you know, I was the oldest, so any older brother figure was instantly amazing. I don't think he's as cool now. He's a little obnoxious. But you know, when I was like 14, 15, oh my God, Randall was so cool. I'm probably more of a Dante, since Clerks is my Sex and the City, I guess. And, you know, I like the one who played Caitlin, Lisa Spooner, who passed away a couple years ago, unfortunately. And I actually like, we don't talk about enough, Marilyn Gugliani, I think, as Veronica, I thought also does a good job, as well as, like, it's interesting to see Chainsaw and Bob looking insanely young, which was weird. They're definitely more of, like, kind of like, just the stoners who hang out. But there's sort of, like, almost like a weird, like, small French movie thing about, like, they're just, like, the guys in the town that hang out. I mean, that's the thing about this movie. It works within what it is. It makes you kind of believe in this movie, you know? I don't know if, you know, I've ever liked any of his movies as much as this, or felt like this is almost the more excusable one or something, because I don't think I feel as inspired after watching the others. I don't know if his filmography represents as much as this movie does to me. It's cool to watch an indie film like this, because it's cool to watch kind of the vibe of this was only in this movie. You know, I feel like Mallrats sort of starts off the Kevin Smith that we'd see, you know, in Color and in everything else, and, you know, using Jason Lee and Ben Affleck and making Jay and Silent Bob more into cartoon characters than making this an entire cartoon, everything about this cartoon characters. But for a small indie film and getting everything that came from it and everything that it represents to people, and, you know, big part of my teen years was rewatching this and thinking how these guys were just so cool, and like everything they were saying was so neat and so interesting. And I think for an indie film, and being older now, when I look at it, I still find the promise in it. I still get what people saw in it. Sure, technology's moved past it, but I think it still shows you, you know, how the right kind of problem solving in filmmaking can make you something special. And somehow the cinema gods smiled and made this happen, and we got Clerks and Kevin Smith and this whole thing. It doesn't make sense. It probably shouldn't happen, but it did. And I think for the grand scheme of things, it has become an important part of culture, and I think we're probably all a little better for it. So if you've seen Clerks and you would like to talk about it, then comment below in the comments and subscribe if you would like to.